The candlelight flickers low, casting long shadows across the stone walls. The convent is silent eerily so, as if the walls themselves are holding their breath. In the center of a small, windowless chamber lies a crude wooden box, a coffin, and beside it, trembling in her coarse linen habit, stands a girl no older than 14. She has not spoken in hours. A nun, older, eyes hard with divine certainty, gestures toward the box. The girl steps forward. This is not a funeral. She is not dead, but she is expected to pretend she is. Inside the coffin, she must lie motionless for a full night, eyes shut, mouth closed, hands folded like a corpse. Outside, the sisters will chant the funeral liturgy. For all intents and purposes, she is being buried alive symbolically. Yes, but to the mind of a child, the difference is negligible. This was the trial of the coffin, a ritual known to have existed in scattered corners of medieval Europe, particularly within the stricter monastic orders. Its purpose was simple and chilling, to teach the novice nun that she must die to the world before she can belong to God. But behind the theology lay something more twisted, something darker. For centuries, the Church had cultivated the image of the nun as a willing bride of Christ, serene, selfless, cloistered from sin. But history is messier than legend. In reality, many of these so-called brides were little more than prisoners in holy garb, placed here not by personal calling, but by family decree, political convenience, or the desire to bury scandal. And so rituals like the coffin trial weren't just spiritual exercises. They were psychological crucibles, tools of control, methods of erasing the self. It began with silence. From the moment a novice entered the cloister, she was stripped of her name, her possessions, and her voice. She was told to speak only when spoken to eat in silence, to confess regularly, to obey without hesitation. In some orders, she was not even allowed to make eye contact with visiting family. Then came the test. The girl in the coffin must face her death alone, conscious and confined. This was not merely about confronting mortality. It was about surrender. Could she relinquish every earthly attachment? Could she lie still in the dark while her own funeral was performed? Could she become nothing? For many, the answer was yes. Some emerged more devout, more fervent, but others emerged broken, and a few did not emerge at all. Records are sparse. Monastic archives rarely recorded failure, but there are hints. Anonymous, marginalia in Latin script, she did not return. Cryptic diary entries, letters written by visiting priests describing young nuns stricken by unnatural fear, and in some cases, physical evidence small, unmarked graves found inside convent walls, their occupants never mentioned in official rolls. Was this madness? Was it faith? Or was it something worse? The institutionalization of emotional cruelty, baptized in the language of holiness. To modern minds, the idea seems unfathomable. Locking a child in a coffin to prove her piety. And yet, within the world of the medieval convent, it made perfect theological sense. The closer one came to death, the closer one came to God. The world was sinful, the body was weak. Only through total submission could one hope to achieve purity. This ideology did not emerge in a vacuum. It was built atop centuries of belief that associated female virtue with silence, stillness, and suffering. The ideal woman was not just modest, she was invisible. And in the convent, invisibility was literal. There were no mirrors, no personal belongings, no laughter after dark. There were only prayers, punishments, and the long, hollow hours of self-denial. In this cloistered world, the coffin was not a punishment. It was a privilege, a test of faith, a rehearsal for the final union with Christ in death. But what did it cost? When dawn finally came, the girl was lifted from the box. Her skin was cold, her lips blue. She had passed, or so the records claimed. But passing such a test did not mean healing. It meant erasure. The girl she had been before the coffin, daughter, sister, child, no longer existed. In her place stood a nun. The ritual had done its work, but behind closed doors, the psychological toll lingered, silent, invisible, and buried beneath layers of prayer and obedience. Because, in this world, obedience was everything, and obedience, as we'll soon see, was often purchased at the cost of a woman's mind. She was not called by God. She was sent long before the candlelight ritual, before the silent cloister and the coffin. The decision had already been made, not by the girl, but by her father, or perhaps by an older brother, a family matriarch, a bishop indebted to a nobleman, someone with more power than her, and far less interest in her heart. In medieval Europe, becoming a nun was not always an act of divine longing. It was often a transaction. For noble families, daughters were financial burdens. Dowries were expensive, and the pool of eligible husbands small. A daughter who was plain, sickly, or simply too many in number could quietly disappear behind the convent walls. Her dowry paid not to a groom, but to God. It was cheaper, safer, cleaner. For lower-born families, it was often about survival, feeding 5 mouths instead of 6, avoiding the shame of an unmarried pregnancy, escaping a reputation already on the verge of ruin. In times of famine or plague, a convent could offer food and protection, but at the cost of freedom, at the cost of a name. And for some girls, there was no choice at all. Inheritance laws favored sons. Authority rested with fathers. Women, particularly young ones, had little agency over their fate. A girl could be cloistered before puberty, dressed in a habit before she'd ever bled, spoken vows before she understood the weight of silence. The ceremony would be beautiful, of course. Incense, bells, Latin blessings. She would kneel before the altar and be declared a bride of Christ, veiled, kissed on the forehead, and led into a life that she had not chosen. And what could she do? Run to where? A girl fleeing a convent was a scandal, a criminal, worse, a sinner. She would be excommunicated, pursued, and sometimes dragged back by force. One 12th century record from France recounts a runaway novice whose father ordered her locked in a church tower until she changed her mind or starved. They called it devotion. It looked more like imprisonment. Even in the wealthiest convents, places with libraries, music, and gardens, the underlying reality was the same. This was not always a life freely embraced. For many, it was exile in holy disguise. It is tempting to romanticize the cloister, to imagine it as a place of quiet reflection, of mutual sisterhood and spiritual fulfillment. And sometimes it was. Some women did choose it, drawn by learning, by leadership, or by genuine faith. But the line between sanctuary and oubliette was perilously thin, because even the most sacred spaces were shaped by very human motivations: greed, shame, fear, and power. And for every mystic who found communion in silence, there were dozens of girls buried alive in it, their voices lost beneath the weight of what others decided for them. to be a bride of Christ, then was not always a vow. Sometimes it was a verdict. The convent walls, high and pious, did not always shield girls from the world. Sometimes they merely kept the world from seeing them in the next breath of this story. We will enter those walls more fully, not through doctrine or ritual, but through what lingered behind the silence, the daily rhythm, the psychological toll, the slow, creeping unraveling of identity. Because faith was only part of the equation. The rest was what happened when you sealed a child from the world, handed her a cross, and told her to vanish. The silence was not peaceful. It throbbed like a pulse, a presence. It filled the cold stone halls and seeped into the marrow of the women who walked them. There were no clocks in a medieval convent, only bells, and those bells rang not with comfort, but command. At 2 a.m., the sisters rose from strofed beds for matins, the first of 7 daily prayers. The air was black and biting. The floor stung bare feet. Their voices echoed through the chapel in low, spectral chant. Latin, always Latin. Few understood the words, but meaning was secondary to obedience. By sunrise, they had already prayed for hours. Meals were small, joyless affairs often silent, occasionally interrupted by scripture read aloud from a pulpit. Meat was forbidden in most orders. Conversation was discouraged. Laughter was a sin of pride. Time moved like wax down a taper, slow and inevitable, until nightfall brought another vigil and a return to the tomb-like cell. There was no privacy, no indulgence, no escape from the mind, and in that fertile darkness, the mind often turned against itself. Some nuns claimed visions, others felt the presence of demons. Some heard voices whispering beneath their pillows, or saw Christ's blood dripping from the crucifix. One sister in 14th century Spain reportedly screamed in ecstasy during midnight prayers, claiming she had received the stigmata. Another in Italy wrote of wrestling with the devil in her sleep, her fingernails torn and bloodied upon waking, with these signs of divine favor, or of psychological collapse. The medieval church had no firm answer. It was a time when mysticism, mental illness, and spiritual fervor were indistinguishable. A woman who hallucinated angels might be praised as a holy visionary or condemned as a heretic, depending on who heard her story and how it threatened the hierarchy. But beneath the miraculous, there was suffering, long-term sensory deprivation, sleep disruption, isolation, and ritualized self-denial can have profound effects on the human brain. Today, psychologists recognize these conditions as catalysts for hallucination and dissociation. In the Middle Ages, they were either revered or feared, but rarely treated with compassion. Flagellation was common. Nuns whipped themselves in imitation of Christ's suffering. Some did so daily. Others wore belts embedded with thorns or chains beneath their robes. One abbess encouraged her novices to sleep, sitting upright in cold water to cool the lusts of the flesh. Some obeyed, some wept, some broke entirely. It was in these cloisters that the line between sanctity and madness began to blur. A cloistered life was meant to elevate the soul, to lift it above worldly concerns. But too often, it buried the self beneath guilt, denial, and ritual pain. The story of Sister Margaretha in 15th century Germany stands out. A nobleman's daughter, she was sent to the convent at 13. By 17, she refused to eat, claiming that God was feeding her directly. By 19, she reported nightly visitations by angels who told her to bleed herself with needles. She did so and bled to death one winter morning during silent prayer. Her death was recorded as a miracle. Another nun, Sister Elisabetta of Siena, reported being possessed by divine joy so intensely that she screamed uncontrollably for hours during Mass. The Mother Superior locked her in a cell for days, claiming she was inflaming the others. Elisabetta was later found to have been hallucinating the image of Christ in the rafters. She died in her sleep, clutching a splinter of wood she believed to be the true cross. No record shows her ever receiving last rites. These were not isolated events. Across convents in France, Italy, England, and the Low Countries, reports of ecstatic episodes and spiritual delirium appear in both ecclesiastical records and private correspondence. Some were written with awe, others with fear. A few were scrubbed from the record entirely, deemed inappropriate for memory. But memory lingers in the cracks of forgotten buildings and the margins of manuscripts, and what they suggest is this: not all who entered the cloister were lost to the world. Some were lost to themselves. In these spaces sealed from the outside, ruled by divine law, and stripped of ordinary human warmth, a kind of slow-motion unraveling could take place. It was quiet, reverent, and utterly tragic. The walls did not speak, but they absorbed everything, and within those stone enclosures, holiness and horror often wore the same face. What began as ritual could become obsession. What was intended as spiritual death could spiral into psychosis, and what was praised as sanctity was sometimes, unmistakably, madness. But not all suffering stayed hidden. In the next breath of this story, we will step into the ritual most feared by novices, the ultimate test of devotion, and the moment many cross the threshold from silence into surrender. The coffin sat in the center of the chapel, like a promise or a threat. Its wood was rough-hewn, unpainted, and cold to the touch. It bore no name, because the girl who entered it was no longer a person. She was, for one long night, a soul in waiting. The trial of the coffin, as it came to be whispered in certain convents, was not part of official Catholic doctrine. You won't find it written into the grand theological texts of the era. It existed in shadows, handed down through oral tradition, mentioned briefly in monastery letters, sometimes described obliquely in the margins of old manuscripts, and yet, for those who endured it, it was real, terrifyingly real. The ritual usually marked the final phase before a novice took her permanent vows. It was a rehearsal for her spiritual death, a moment to demonstrate total detachment from the world she once belonged to, a death of ego, a death of desire, a death of identity. She would be told to fast beforehand. In some convents, the girls did not eat for 3 days before the ritual. Their stomachs gnawed with emptiness. Their heads buzzed with dread. Then came the hour. By torchlight, she was led to the chapel. The sisters processed behind her, chanting the words of the Office of the Dead, a liturgy normally reserved for funerals. It spoke of dust, of judgment, of the worms that feast on flesh. She was not to flinch, not to cry. To react was to reveal attachment. When they reached the altar, the coffin was opened. She climbed in. Some were ordered to lie still for 1 hour. Others, all night. A few, the records hint, stayed inside for days, given only water. Their meals passed to them through a small side panel, like an animal in a cage. In some convents, a nun would read aloud the novice's eulogy, describing her former life in the past tense. In others, a bell was rung, as if announcing her death to the world. One abbey in the south of France reportedly laid a black veil over the coffin. sealing it in darkness inside. The girl was instructed to meditate, to contemplate her death, the rotting of her body, the fate of her soul. She was meant to feel terror and transcend it, to stare into the abyss and not blink, but many did. There are scattered accounts of novices who fainted in the coffin, who screamed, who pounded the sides and begged to be released. Their punishments were severe: isolation, silence, delayed vows, or removal from the convent entirely. One 15th century novice in Normandy was sent to a rural house of correction for disrupting the holy sleep, but others simply. Broken account from a convent near Cologne describes a girl who emerged from the ritual unable to speak. She stared at the floor for weeks, refused food, and eventually had to be nursed by older nuns. She never recovered. Her name was erased from the official register. Her grave was marked only with a cross. These were not theatrical performances. They were psychological crucibles, and they worked, because for those who survived, something shifted. The ritual killed the part of them that resisted. It buried the longing, the doubt, the voice that still remembered another life. It created, in its place, a vessel, empty, obedient, and devout. But obedience, in this context, was not submission to God alone. It was submission to the convent, to its rules, its hierarchy, its silent, grinding machinery. The coffin was the ultimate metaphor. You entered as yourself, flawed, frightened, incomplete. You emerged, if you emerged, reborn as what they needed you to be, silent, invisible, sanctified, and yet the scars remained, because death, even symbolic death, does not come without consequence. For the younger girls, especially those sent to convents in childhood, the trial could trigger lifelong anxiety, depression, or spiritual mania. Some became compulsive penitents, flagellating themselves daily. Others withdrew completely, speaking only when forced, shrinking from touch, sleeping on bare stone in a self-imposed imitation of the grave. One chronicler from the Low Countries described a nun who requested to sleep in her coffin for the rest of her life, claiming that it was the only place she felt close to God. Her superiors agreed. When she died 20 years later, she was buried in the same box, and still. The practice continued, because the coffin wasn't just about death, it was about control, about teaching a girl that the highest virtue was vanishing, that to be holy was to be absent. That silence was superior to speech, submission more sacred than selfhood, that the more she ceased to exist, the more divine she became. The Church never officially endorsed the ritual, but it never condemned it either. Like many medieval practices, it lived in the margins, quietly sanctioned by those who believed that pain purified, and that women, above all, must be purified through erasure. The coffin, then, was not an anomaly. It was a window into a system that demanded not just devotion, but disappearance. And behind every girl who emerged, silent from the box, stood a doctrine that celebrated her as a success, not for who she was, but for how completely she had surrendered. But what happens when a body refuses to forget it is flesh? When desire, hunger, and memory push back against the grave? In the next chapter of this story, we descend into that deeper conflict, the war between the sacred ideal and the aching reality of being human. The body was the battleground. It bled, it hungered, it remembered, and in the medieval convent, it betrayed to be a bride of Christ was to wage a constant war, not against external temptation, but against the aching, pulsing truth of the body itself. Flesh was suspect. Flesh was dangerous. And above all, flesh was female. Church fathers had long warned of women's inherent corruption, Eve's failure, Mary's impossible purity, the terrifying power of desire, and within the cloister, that doctrine took on skin and teeth. Many orders required nuns to wear cilices belts, lined with thorns or spikes that bit into the waist and thighs. The pain was constant, sometimes infected. Sisters would kneel in prayer with blood soaking through their habits. To remove the cilice without permission was a sin. To complain was worse. Others bound their breasts tightly to prevent sinful swelling. Some slept on broken boards or flagellated themselves before bed, if they woke in the night with desire. The church warned of such pollutions. They were to fast for 3 days and confess in public. Desire was not just unwelcome, it was punished. In some convents, meals were cut for those who smiled too brightly. A girl who seemed too attached to another sister could be reassigned, forbidden to speak, made to eat alone. And if she resisted, the punishment was isolation. Days in a dark cell, no food, no candle, no prayer. And yet, despite the fear and surveillance, desire crept in. There are letters, hidden, smuggled, frantic, some from nuns to local priests, others from sister to sister. One found in a 14th century German convent reads simply, "I have seen the wounds of Christ in your eyes. Do not leave me alone with them." It is both confession and love letter, a cry torn between doctrine and need. Not all love was spiritual. In quiet corners, amid endless routine, attachments formed, sometimes maternal, sometimes romantic, sometimes something far more dangerous. Human contact, even a brush of the hand, became sacred and forbidden at once. There are stories of nuns caught in embrace, of secret trysts in the gardens, discovered and punished. One account tells of 2 sisters chained apart in their cells for a year, forbidden to speak or look at one another again. Their names are not recorded. Their offense was unnatural affection, and when desire crossed gender lines, the punishment was worse. In 1475, a nun in Avignon was discovered to be pregnant. She refused to name the father. Some claimed it was a visiting monk. Others whispered of the bishop himself. She was excommunicated, confined to a lower crypt, and left there until childbirth. The infant died. So did she. Her story, like so many others, was scrubbed from official records. But pieces survived in angry notes from rival clerics, in the scribbled margins of a confessor's journal, enough to know it was not isolated, not rare, because no ritual, no coffin, no cilice, no vow could erase what the church feared most, that a woman might still be a body, that she might still want, and that she might refuse to hate herself for it. So suffering became the solution. If desire could not be removed, it could be punished. If joy could not be silenced, it could be drowned. The holier the woman, the more she was expected to hurt. Martyrdom was a model. So was Mary, silent, bleeding, forever sorrowful. And in this distorted ideal, pain became currency. The more a woman bled, the more divine she seemed. The less she spoke, the purer she was believed. A holy woman was one who had scrubbed herself from herself until nothing remained but a shadow of sanctity. It worked too well. Some became saints, some became corpses, some became both. But in every case, the lesson remained. Your body is not yours. Your desire is not welcome. Your silence is salvation. Yet silence cannot hold forever. Not when so many women began to speak, not with their mouths, but with their visions, their ecstasies, their strange and sudden powers. And in the next chapter, We meet those women, the ones who refuse to be forgotten, and who walked a perilous line between sainthood and scandal. They saw visions, they spoke in tongues, they bled from wounds they did not cause, and for a time they were worshipped in the late Middle Ages. Mystic nuns became the Church's paradoxical obsession. They were living miracles, poor, cloistered women who claimed direct communion with God. Their stories were copied, shared, and passed across kingdoms. Pilgrims came to touch their relics. Bishops listened when they spoke, but only when their visions stayed within the lines. Hildegard of Bingen is perhaps the most famous, a 12th century abbess who heard music in the stars and wrote prophetic texts that stunned the male clergy of her day. She composed symphonies. She described the structure of the cosmos. She wrote letters to popes and emperors, and they answered. But Hildegard was rare, protected, educated. Noble others were not so fortunate. Consider Marjorie Kemp, a 15th century Englishwoman who claimed visions of Christ, the Virgin Mary, and numerous saints. She wept uncontrollably during Mass. She screamed with joy at the Eucharist. She wandered across Europe in ecstatic pilgrimage, and she terrified almost everyone. The clergy accused her of heresy more than once. She was arrested, threatened, mocked. Her behavior was deemed excessive, not because it was false, but because it was uncontrollable. It could not be tamed. That was the danger in the male-dominated hierarchy of the Church. Power was meant to flow down from God to pope, to priest, to parishioner. A woman claiming direct access to the divine bypassed that order entirely. She could not be ordained, but she could inspire. She could not preach, but she could prophesy. And in doing so, she became both sacred and suspect. Mystic nuns walked a razor's edge. If their visions aligned with church doctrine, if they promoted humility, obedience, suffering, they were embraced. Their writings were copied, their names venerated. Their pain became useful. But when their revelations challenged authority, when they claimed that God spoke through them more clearly than through priests, when they accused abbots of sin or condemned bishops in their dreams, then they became dangerous. Sister Benedetta Carlini, a 17th century abbess in Tuscany, claimed to experience Christ's passion in her body. She spoke with angels. She bore invisible wounds. Her fame grew until she was investigated, and what the Church found shocked them. Benedetta had a secret sexual relationship with another nun, and her visions, they concluded, were theatrics born of manipulation. She was stripped of power, imprisoned for decades. Her prophecies were burned. Benedetta was not the only one. Across Europe, convent records show patterns of veneration followed by punishment. Holy women were revered when they were useful, when their suffering reinforced the Church's ideals, but when they stepped outside their role, even slightly, their sanctity curdled into suspicion. Visions became lies. Ecstasies became madness. Wounds became evidence of witchcraft, because behind the praise was always control. The mystic nun was a perfect tool. She inspired the faithful, reminded them of the supernatural, and demonstrated the beauty of submission, but only if she herself remained submissive, and submission had limits. A woman could speak to God, but not too clearly. She could suffer, but not lead. She could be holy, but never powerful. So the saints became scapegoats. The revered became reviled. The brides of Christ became threats to his earthly kingdom, yet their voices endured in the pages of worn manuscripts, in the echoes of convent walls, in the uneasy legacy of a church that praised women's suffering but feared their strength, And in the next descent into this story, we follow that fear to its most fevered expression, when entire convents erupted into screaming, writhing fits, and the church declared it was not God who had entered them, but the devil. They said the devil walked the halls of the convents. They said he slithered in through the cracks in the stone, whispered through the iron bars of the confessional, and slid beneath the beds of chaste women who moaned and thrashed in the night. But behind the smoke and sulphur, the truth was colder. By the 17th century, the boundaries between sanctity and madness had grown thin. Across France, Germany, and parts of Italy, reports multiplied of women in religious orders falling under possession. Their bodies convulsed, their mouths spewed curses, their cries filled the cloisters, not with prayer, but with howls. In truth, these were not isolated incidents, but symptoms of centuries of forced obedience, erotic suppression, and divine silence. In France, the most infamous case began with a single voice. It was 1632 in Loudun, a sleepy town of steeples. And suspicion, a young Ursuline nun, cloistered, devout, and likely very frightened, claimed that a demon had violated her sleep. Others quickly followed. Within weeks, nearly the entire convent was in chaos. The nuns claimed they were tormented by spirits. They convulsed, tore their clothes, barked like dogs. Some meowed like cats for hours on end. They named one man at the center of it all, Abbain Grandier, a local priest with a reputation for arrogance and a string of rumored affairs. Had Grandier bewitched them? Or had these women, locked away from the world, simply found a language for their suffering? The church had no time for doubt. They saw a spectacle and a scapegoat. Grandier was arrested. He denied everything. Under torture, he was broken, and under pressure, the evidence mounted. They said he signed a pact with the devil, they claimed. They found it a literal document, written in blood and Latin, bearing names of demons and promises of flesh. In truth, the document was forged. The evidence was fabricated. But that didn't matter. In August 1634, Grandier was burned alive in the town square, while the nuns howled in their cells, still possessed. To the public, it was divine justice. To history, it was mass hysteria. Weaponized for control, the Loudun possessions were not unique. In convents across Europe, girls as young as 12 claimed to be tormented by Satan. Some believed it, others performed it. Some had fits so violent their bones fractured, others levitated or claimed to. Priests and physicians debated whether they were witches, saints, or madwomen. But few asked what forces, social, spiritual, and psychological, had brought them to this edge. Consider the convent of Wurzburg in Bavaria. There, in the 1740s, more than 50 nuns reportedly fell into fits of possession. They screamed. They cursed the Virgin. They hallucinated serpents in their cells. The public watched, horrified and fascinated. For many, these events confirmed that Satan was real. But they also revealed something else, the fragility of the female mind, as defined by male theology, and always the response was punishment. Possessed were exorcised with brutal rituals, bound to beds, starved, bled. Some were whipped, others were isolated, left alone in stone cells, with only crucifixes and silence for company. Those who didn't recover were sometimes declared witches and quietly disappeared. To the outside world, this was divine warfare, good versus evil. But inside the minds of these women, something more complex was happening. Possession, in many cases, offered what the convent denied: attention, agency, a voice for girls forced into vows against their will, traded like dowry to God possession, was one of the only languages they were allowed to speak. It allowed them to express anger, sexual frustration, grief. Their bodies, forbidden to feel, became battlegrounds where all those feelings fought for air. A nun who collapsed in chapel, shouting obscenities, was not merely mad, she was erupting. From decades of repression, the Church framed this as sin. Historians now see trauma, dissociation, psychological collapse. In modern terms, conversion, disorder, hysteria, the body keeping secrets the mouth was never permitted to say. But in the 1600s, there were no such diagnoses, only demons and punishment. The irony is bitter. The same institutions that silenced women then punished them for screaming. The same cloisters that demanded purity accused those who broke under its weight of inviting evil. And the public, hungry for drama, cloaked in incense and fire, watched eagerly, never questioning what it meant to live a life where every thought had to pass through God before it could be spoken. In these convents, divine suffering and demonic possession became two sides of the same coin. One earned sainthood, the other earned the stake, but both were rooted in the same soil: silence, submission, and the unbearable burden of being holy in a world that never let women be human. And the spectacle was far from over. For some, the possession would pass. For others, the exorcisms would continue for years. But for a few, the most broken, the most devout, or perhaps simply the most forgotten, the Church had one final answer. If the soul could not be healed, it could at least be buried alive. There are doors in old convents that no one dares to open, wooden panels warped by centuries of damp breath, rusted hinges sealed by silence rather than nails. Behind them, nothing, or perhaps everything. In 1997, workers restoring a 17th century convent in southern Italy pried open a bricked-up wall. What they found wasn't rot or relics, but bones, small, fragile, many of them female. Some still bore fragments of rosary beads. Others had bits of lace pressed between rib cages, as if buried with final dignity in a place meant only for forgetting. There was no record of a crypt. No names, no prayers, just the unmistakable scent of long-contained decay. This was not an isolated discovery. Across Europe, as cloisters were deconsecrated, turned into museums or private homes, the same pattern emerged. In France, a cellar yielded femurs and jawbones, mingled in soft soil. In Austria, beneath a convent chapel, a pit was found, with skulls stacked like firewood, unmarked and untouched for centuries. No gravestones, no ledgers, just whispers, and a history written in calcium and dust. These weren't battlefield casualties. They weren't plague victims. They were women, nuns, or once nuns, daughters sent to God and never heard from again. Some likely died of illness, others of childbirth, secret shame in places where vows were meant to bar sin. Some went mad, and some, historians now suspect, were buried not as an act of mercy, but of concealment. If a girl in the convent broke under the weight of obedience, if she screamed too often, bled too much, or defied to clearly, she might vanish. Quietly, a death unrecorded, a burial hurried. She would not be mourned. She would be erased. And the convent walls, thick and mute, kept their promise never to tell. Occasionally, a hint escapes. a diary hidden behind false panels, a note in a marginalia scrawled in Latin, trembling in ink. Sora Magdalena is no longer with us. May God forgive what we could not. We do not know who Sister Magdalena was. We only know she was once there, and then not. Beneath all the sacred rites and solemn hymns, these institutions became mausoleums of silence. Not just physical, but spiritual. Ritualized anonymity was part of the theology. You are not supposed to be remembered for yourself, only for your obedience to God. To die in a convent was not tragedy, was transfiguration. But what if you were never truly mourned? What if your body was hidden because your suffering was inconvenient? There are stories persistent, bone-chilling of girls who gave birth in secret, whose infants were taken, of novices who disappeared, after fits of madness, or after accusing a confessor of touching them in ways no scripture allowed. There were no inquiries, no trials, just locked doors and then locked memories. Over time, even the surviving sisters forgot the names of those buried in the floor beneath them, and so the promise of eternal salvation turned to something else. Unmarked oblivion, the Church taught that the soul lived forever. But these women's stories did not. Their prayers vanished into brick. Their deaths left no songs. Just damp corridors and the occasional echo of something not quite gone. In the cold calculus of salvation, they were accounted for spiritually, but not humanly. Today, when tourists walk through these old cloisters, they marvel at the tapestries, the stained glass, the cloister gardens kept in symmetrical bloom. Few notice the walls that bulge slightly, the sealed archways, or the narrow wooden doors that never open. Fewer still ask, who might be behind them? Some of the bones found belonged to girls no older than 14. Some bore signs of restraint-twisted limbs, healed fractures, jawbones, missing teeth long before death. Their silence was not chosen, it was enforced. We are left to guess their names, or perhaps we are not meant to. That was the point in these cloisters of eternal promise. Some women became ghosts long before they died. Others were never allowed to leave a trace. But even stone forgets imperfectly. The bones still rise, the doors still creak, and every so often, in the right light, history breathes through the cracks. Centuries passed, stone walls weathered, cloisters emptied, the rituals softened, then dissolved. Some convents became schools, others were repurposed into hospitals, libraries, or luxury hotels. The world moved on, but silence has a way of surviving, in dusty archives and half-burned letters, in whispered folklore passed between grandmothers and granddaughters, the shadows of what once happened behind monastery. Walls remain. The myth of the saintly nun still lingers, peaceful, obedient, eyes turned to heaven. A woman without desire, without rebellion, without self. The perfect vessel for divine light. Popular culture clings to her on prayer cards, in black and white films, in sentimental novels about quiet devotion, but myths are often used to bury truth. That image obscures something harder, darker, the cost of erasing women's voices in the name of holiness. In memoirs from former nuns, those who left in the 19th and 20th centuries, when it finally became possible to walk away, we find a recurring ache. Not rage, not even regret, but a bone-deep quiet. As if years spent suppressing thought and instinct had hollowed out the capacity to speak. Some rite of guilt so automatic they flinched at laughter years after leaving. Others recalled the way certain hymns made their hands tremble, not from nostalgia, but from an old, trained fear they had learned from girlhood. that suffering was sacred, that silence was purity, that to speak discomfort was to betray God. And this teaching did not dissolve when the convents opened their doors. It leaked outward into families where daughters were still told to obey without question, into schools where discipline mirrored ascetic control, into marriages where submission was framed as spiritual virtue. The habits of control, the psychological choreography of suppression outlived the institutions that first imposed them. Religious trauma, unlike physical violence, rarely leaves marks. There are no bruises to point to, no wounds to stitch. It moves invisibly, threading through memory and belief, shaping the very idea of selfhood. For many women, especially those raised in deeply Catholic households, the voice of God sounded suspiciously like the voice of shame. You are not enough. You are dangerous. Your thoughts are temptations. Your body is a battlefield. Your silence is your strength. This was the catechism behind the catechism. And when it was passed down quietly, maternally, it began to look like culture rather than coercion. 1,000 small denials, inherited like heirlooms. Women telling other women not to want too much, not to speak too loudly, not to stray too far from the lines, drawn by invisible hands. The convent may have been left behind, but its ghost sat at the dinner table. Even in countries where Catholicism waned, the archetype of the holy woman remained potent. Literature rewarded the self-sacrificing heroine. Cinema idealized the quiet martyr. Society praised the mother who gave everything and asked for nothing. These were secular saints' daughters of the convent in spirit, if not in name, and yet fragments of rebellion survived in the notebooks of mystic women, scribbled in margins, in the legends of saints who wept blood or heard voices no one else could, in the hushed stories of novices who vanished, of abbesses who defied bishops, of women who died not because they were wicked, but because they refused to disappear. The silence was not complete, and that, perhaps, is the most unsettling truth. Even in the most repressive systems, something resists. A thought, a breath, a name remembered against all odds. Today, the bones found in convent crypts can be studied, dated, traced. Their DNA may yet speak what history refused to, but the deeper legacy, the psychological architecture built on obedience, the slow internal erosion of self, cannot be so easily exhumed. It lives on in unexplained shame, in generations, taught to endure rather than question, in the way certain women, even now, lower their voices when they speak of desire. Centuries later, the convent walls have crumbled, but the silence still echoes. It always begins with a door heavy, wooden, sometimes iron-bound, closed from the outside. Behind Itagal kneels, dressed in white. She's 17, maybe younger. Her hair has been shorn, her name changed, her past erased by ritual. Candles flicker, psalms echo in Latin, and then the box is brought forward. A coffin. It isn't for the dead, not yet. It's for her. A symbolic burial. Some were told to lie inside it. Others merely touched the wood or stared down into its shadowed depths. But the meaning was the same. This was death to the world, a farewell to selfhood, to voice, to flesh, to ambition. If she entered as someone's daughter, she emerged as no one's at all. She was now the bride of Christ. The ritual was framed as beautiful, sacred, holy, but behind the symbolism stood a stark and violent theology. To be good, a woman had to disappear. The coffin made this doctrine visible. It taught girls that the price of salvation was self-erasure. And for many, it wasn't just metaphor. There were girls who never left the convent again, who became too ill to walk the halls and were quietly interred beneath chapel floors. Girls whose records listed them as mad, possessed, defiant, buried not with ceremony but with shame. Their bones, when unearthed centuries later, often bore no name. Their stories, if recorded at all, were filtered through the language of sin. They were not mourned. They were explained. This was the faith that buried girls, alive not always in earth, but in obedience. Across centuries and continents, convent walls concealed lives that had been emptied rather than fulfilled. The rule books written by male clergy spelled out every detail of a nun's day: when to rise, when to speak, when to fast, when to kneel. Silence was not a spiritual gift, it was mandatory. Laughter was suspicious. Hunger was holy. Love, less directed at Christ, was corruption. Inside this rigid system, girls were expected to annihilate their wills, and when they couldn't, when they cracked under the weight of perfection, when their minds frayed or their bodies rebelled, weren't offered freedom, they were offered correction. More prayer, more isolation, or sometimes a grave. In 17th century France, at the convent of Loudun, a group of Ursuline nuns erupted in public fit screaming, writhing, accusing a priest of summoning demons. The church called it possession. The priest was executed, but modern scholars see something else: a mass psychogenic illness born of repression so deep it exploded into spectacle. The women had no safe language for desire, fear, or rage, so their bodies spoke in screams. Elsewhere, in cloisters from Germany to Italy, visitors reported seeing nuns crawling like animals, clawing at walls, or speaking in tongues. To confess inner torment was to risk eternal damnation. To repress it was to risk madness. There was no safe way out, and still girls kept entering, not always by choice. Some were second daughters, surplus to marriage plans. Others were orphans, or bastards, or victims of scandal. Some believed the convent offered refuge, some were devout. But once inside, even belief could be weaponized. To question the system was to question God, and so the coffin remained, not always visible, not always literal, but always present. It was there in the way nuns were buried, without family present, in how they were denied last rites for small infractions, in the stories of novices who bled from self-flagellation, in the suicide notes that never made it to archives. And yet the world outside admired their discipline. Visitors described cloisters as peaceful. They mistook silence for serenity. They romanticized the order. They wrote books and painted portraits. They called these women brides, forgetting that real brides have choices. What the world saw was the surface. What the girls inside lived was the slow, methodical burial of self. This was not a horror story with one villain. It was a system, a theology, a culture of control draped in incense and scripture. Its legacy did not die when the walls came down. Even now, the echoes remain, in cultures where female obedience is still sanctified, in families where shame is passed down like scripture, in institutions that demand silence in exchange for belonging. The coffin, in many ways, was the purest symbol of that demand. Enter it, and you'll be holy. Stay still, and you'll be saved. Don't move, don't speak, don't think, just lie there. And yet we must ask, how many girls were buried, alive not in soil, but in rolls? How many were mourned before they died? How many lay down in those symbolic coffins, never realizing they might never get back up, because the ritual was not a performance, it was a promise, that if you give us your life, we will grant you heaven. But the cost was staggering, and the reward deferred until death. There are photographs from the early 1900s of young novices in their final vows, eyes downcast, hands folded, surrounded by nuns in black like mourners. One girl lies prostrate on the floor, her body forming a cross. Around her, the others sing. It looks like a funeral. It was, and not only for her, it was for every girl who learned that God only loved her when she vanished, for every mind that broke beneath the weight of sainthood, for every woman who lived a life shaped like a tomb. Today, the Church rarely uses coffins in profession ceremonies. The ritual is considered outdated to morbid, a relic of an earlier, more dramatic age. But the story it told, the faith that praised death over desire, silence over truth, submission over self, is not as dead as we might like to believe. It still lingers in the way some girls are raised to shrink, in the way obedience is still dressed as virtue, in the way sanctity and suffering remain intertwined. So let us not end with the coffin. Let us end with the question it asked. What kind of faith builds itself on the burial of girls? And how many are still lying there, unseen, waiting, perhaps not for resurrection, but for remembrance? Because memory, unlike silence, does not obey it. It speaks, it names, it exhumes, and sometimes it saves.